In 1962, a Soviet submarine being depth-charged by the U.S. Navy was one vote away from launching a nuclear torpedo. One officer refused and saved the world. The Americans didn't know the submarine was carrying a nuclear weapon. The Soviets thought war had already begun, and the decision that prevented the end of civilization was made by a single man in the dark, under the ocean, while his shipmates screamed at him to fire. October 1962. The Cuban Missile Crisis was at its peak. Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev had placed nuclear missiles in Cuba, 90 miles from the United States. American President John F. Kennedy had ordered a naval blockade. The two superpowers were closer to nuclear war than they had ever been, or have been, since. What the American government did not know was that 4 Soviet submarines were operating in the waters around Cuba. Each was armed with conventional torpedoes and one additional weapon, a nuclear torpedo with a warhead roughly equal in power to the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. Submarine B-59 was one of them. It had been at sea for weeks, mostly submerged, cut off from radio contact with Moscow. The crew of 78 men was operating in temperatures that reached 45 to 50 degrees Celsius inside the hull. Carbon dioxide levels had risen so high that men were losing consciousness. They hadn't received orders in days. They didn't know what was happening above them. On October 27th, a group of 11 American destroyers and the aircraft carrier USS Randolph detected B-59 and forced it to the surface using signaling depth charges, explosives designed to be non-lethal, meant only to force a submarine up. But inside B-59, no one knew that. They had been out of contact with Moscow for days. They had been listening to American civilian radio broadcasts, which reported that fighting had broken out. The depth charges were exploding against the hull. The captain, Valentin Savitsky, concluded that war had started. He gave the order to prepare the nuclear torpedo for launch. Under Soviet naval protocol, launching a nuclear weapon required the authorization of 3 officers: the captain, the political officer, and the chief of staff of the submarine brigade. On B-59, the chief of staff happened to be aboard, Vasily Arkhipov, a 36-year-old officer who had already survived one nuclear near-disaster. The world's first nuclear submarine accident aboard K-19 the year before. Captain Savitsky was screaming. The political officer agreed with him. The torpedo was ready. Arkhipov said no. The argument that followed was conducted in a metal tube, in near-total darkness, at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean, while depth charges detonated around the hull. Arkhipov's position was simple. They had not received direct orders from Moscow. They could not confirm that war had actually begun. Firing a nuclear weapon without confirmation would guarantee the outcome they were trying to avoid. He would not authorize the launch. Savitsky eventually relented. B-59 surfaced. The crew was ordered above deck into the Atlantic air while American ships circled around them. The Americans watching from the destroyers had no idea what had just almost happened. They didn't know the submarine was carrying a nuclear torpedo. They didn't know that the crew had nearly fired it. They didn't know that a single officer's refusal had just prevented the United States Navy from being struck by a nuclear weapon in international waters, an act that would almost certainly have triggered a full-scale nuclear exchange. In 2002, Thomas Blanton, director of the U.S. National Security Archive, said simply, "Vasily Arkhipov saved the world." Vasily Arkhipov returned to the Soviet Union and continued his naval career. He was never publicly celebrated. The incident aboard B-59 was classified for decades. Arkhipov himself rarely spoke about it. The full details of what happened inside submarine B-59 on October 27, 1962, were not made public until 2002, 40 years later, at a conference in Havana where surviving participants from both sides compared notes for the first time. American officials who attended were visibly shaken. Robert McNamara, who had been Kennedy's Secretary of Defense during the crisis, said after hearing the full account, "We came very close. Closer than we knew." Arkhipov died in 1998, 4 years before the story of what he had done became widely known. He was 72. On October 27, 1962, the fate of human civilization was put to a vote inside a Soviet submarine. 2 men voted to end it. 1 man voted to let it continue. The 1 man who prevented nuclear war. Not a president, not a general, a naval officer with no special authority, no direct line to Moscow. Nothing but his own judgment and a refusal to fire a weapon he wasn't certain needed to be fired. Most people have never heard his name. The world he saved kept turning without ever knowing he was the one who saved it. Subscribe if you want more. See you in the next one.